When we call a friend, not with an agenda or not because we're trying to plan something, but just because we want to check on them. We don't have to solve every problem they have, but just knowing that they are not alone, knowing that they have somebody who looks out for them, that is so important in a world where so many people are walking around feeling invisible, feeling like no one cares.
This is Hourglass, the podcast for United Way of King County in Seattle. Coming up, a conversation about loneliness featuring the U.S. Surgeon General, who recently visited United Way-supported Red Eagle Soaring Youth Theater here as part of his national tour to spread the word about the epidemic of social isolation. We will also hear about United Way's Our Neighbor Fund and our upcoming event with the Seattle Mariners. I'm your host, Joe Burris. Thanks for tuning in. Here in the U.S., we have so many ways to keep ourselves preoccupied, so many ways to connect with others. We have public parks, theme parks, national parks, and ballparks. We have community centers, community gardens, bedroom communities, and community colleges. We have day parties, afternoon teas, and nightclubs. And when we don't feel like socializing with others or connecting in person, we have cable television, which currently has about 125 channels. We have gaming, streaming, texting, messaging, chat rooms, and social media. When it comes to interactions, the possibilities are endless. So what's with all the loneliness? Why is it that according to the American Pediatric Association, 1 out of 3 Americans say they feel lonely at least once a week, and 1 out of 10 say they feel lonely every day? And what are we as a nation doing to address loneliness, which the CDC says has been linked to an increased risk of heart disease, type 2 diabetes, depression, addiction, and early death? Fortunately, U.S. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy has taken it upon himself to do something about it. Last year, Murthy declared loneliness and social isolation a national epidemic in the United States. He said that about half of American adults are experiencing considerable loneliness, and that the COVID-19 pandemic only made it worse. Murthy says that though we may have many ways to connect socially, our participation in activities and social settings have been declining for nearly half a century. And he says though there are many benefits to the internet and other forms of technology, some folks, particularly children, are spending too much time online, often at the detriment of the most effective way for people to connect with each other, in person. Fortunately, he says, we don't need a prescription to treat this ailment. Loneliness can be cured by being proactive about making social connections. It starts, Murthy says, by reaching out to people we care about and taking advantage of settings where communities gather. But he also called on lawmakers to enact pro-connection policies that include family-paid leave and accessible public transportation. Murthy has canvassed the country, urging people to see loneliness and isolation as a health crisis. On a recent trip to Seattle, Murthy joined Washington State Secretary of Health Umayya Shah for a discussion on social isolation and loneliness as part of a State Department speaker series on promoting health equity and spotlighting innovative ideas about wellness. The event took place at Red Eagle Soaring, a United Way of King County-supported Indigenous youth theater company. Shah said Red Eagle Soaring was chosen for the event to spotlight a local group that connects communities. Red Eagle Soaring serves young people across King, Pierce, and Snohomish counties and fosters social connections through art and culture. The event drew a standing room-only crowd, and United Way was there. Murthy and Shaw spoke candidly and personally about the effects of loneliness, and the discussion began with Murthy explaining how our need for social connections has evolved over time.
Imagine thousands of years ago, we're hunter-gatherers. We are existing in a world where there are a lot of hardships and challenges, weather-related predators, starvation is a real thing. And the way that we survive is we come together in small groups of trusted individuals. We share our food. We help take care of each other's children. We take watch at night to make sure that everyone is safe. We learn to live together and recognize that when we are connected with one another in trusted relationships, we actually all do better and we have a much greater likelihood of survival. And that is actually, in some variant of that, is how we lived for thousands of years. I want to contrast that to now and how we live now. Elements of that still exist in our communities. There are still places where people do have trusted relationships and they're connected to one another. They look out for one another. But increasingly, there are people across our country who feel disconnected from any sense of community, who don't feel that there are people who have their backs and are looking out for them, who don't feel like they are part of other people's lives in meaningful ways. This is a challenge that preceded the pandemic, this development of loneliness and isolation. It's a complex product of both decline over decades and our participation in organizations that brought us together. It's also partly the result of the fact that we just move around a lot more and we don't have the same anchoring in communities that we grew up with. We change jobs often. That may take us from community to community. And finally, I just think that the impact of technology on our lives has been mixed. We don't have to see each other anymore at the grocery store or the post office or in a retail store. Many of our relationships on social media have become substitutes for what used to be in-person interaction. And especially for our kids who don't have often another reference point, of what having a primarily in-person set of social relationships is like, that trade-off has been detrimental. So anyway, you put all this together and you see that we have become, in the grand scheme of human existence, quite lonely and isolated, despite the fact that we live in more densely populated parts of the world, and despite the fact that we are connected through our devices and technology. And the reason that we issued last year a Surgeon General's advisory on this topic of loneliness is because we found that when people are experiencing that kind of social disconnection, it's really bad for their health. And it's not just a bad feeling. When I was a kid growing up, struggling with loneliness as an introverted, shy kid in school, worried about lunchtime every day when I would walk into the cafeteria and not know if there'd be somebody to sit next to. Like that, I just thought that was a bad feeling. I was like, it's terrible. I hate feeling like that, but I just got to suck it up. Never talked to anyone about it, felt ashamed about it. But what we've learned since then is loneliness is incredibly common. Right? So right now in America, 1 in 2 adults are living with measurable levels of loneliness, but the numbers are much higher among young people, actually. But we also learned how consequential it is, right? The increased risk of everything from anxiety, depression, and suicide to heart disease and dementia and premature death that come with being socially disconnected. When I saw the data that showed the mortality impact of loneliness was comparable to smoking daily, it was even greater than what we see with obesity. As somebody who sits in an office that for generations has focused on issues like tobacco and obesity, it made me realize that this issue, loneliness, is a public health concern that's just as important as those.
So I want to pick up on something you talked a little bit about, this power of the collective. One of the challenges is how do we continue to support and invest, not just in the individual, but the collective of community partnerships and aspects like that. I know you've talked a lot about culture. You've talked a lot about storytelling, the connectedness. How do you bring that all together with investment and support of work that's happening in places like this?
When you look at what's happened, across the country more broadly, a lot of that infrastructure has weakened or disintegrated over time across the board, right? So like I mentioned earlier, that participation in faith organizations has diminished. But it's not just faith, right? We see participation in recreational leagues and service organizations, right? And many of the entities that used to bring us together, that's all diminished. And so I think of that as a critical part of this social infrastructure in our communities that we need to rebuild. Now, we rebuild that in part by telling stories about culture, stories about purpose as well. We're strongest often when we feel like we have a set of common values, but also a common purpose that's driving us forward. But we also build community by doing things together, and in particular by serving together. Right? So it's one thing, if you just throw a group of 100 people in a room and you say, go forth and connect, right? Some people will connect just through Brownian motion, right? But many people won't, and they may not have an opportunity or an easy on-ramp, if you will, to opening up and to sharing and to learning about one another. So how do we create those on-ramps? Well, it turns out that service is actually one way that we do that. If you take one type of service, military service, for example, in our country, one of the reasons that has been such a powerful experience for so many service members is because it brings them together across backgrounds and differences for a common cause, to have a common experience where they're actually doing something together. And that doesn't always mean being in the theater of war, right? Even training together is a powerful experience, right? Serving in a community together, which many of our service members do during times of major crisis, hurricanes, etc. That is very powerful. So I find myself thinking, what could we help people do together in our communities? Come together in person, serve, and through that actually come to know one another. That I think would be a powerful form of social infrastructure. It's not a moral statement. I think it's actually partly an evolutionary statement, because for much of our history, we did things together. We evolved to be a community, to function in relationship to one another. And that's what we now have to intentionally come back to if we truly want to be healthy and thrive.
What you just said about collective working together, there's another aspect of this, is that it actually leads to better health outcomes. It actually gets you to combat the detrimental effects of loneliness. Mm-hmm. Can you just talk about that piece, about the collective, but how does it improve health?
It's long been known that stress can be bad for our health, right? And it's not any type of stress. Like mild amounts of stress or moderate amounts of stress intermittently can actually help us, right? So think about when you go to the gym, when you lift weights or run on a treadmill, do the elliptical, you're stressing your body, right? But when you do that at moderate levels, intermittently over time, you actually become stronger. But when you have an excessive amount of stress, or when that stress is prolonged, that's when you run into trouble, right? So if I go to the gym and I lift a 50-pound dumbbell and hold it in fixed position for like an hour, I'm going to injure something quite badly, right? The thing about relationships and community is that community and relationships are natural buffers to stress. And right now we're living in a time where people are at extraordinarily high levels of stress. And that stress has an impact on their mental and physical health. When our stress levels are high, that's when we have higher circulating levels of cortisol. It's when we see inflammation levels go up in our body. Chronic inflammation, we know, damages our tissue and blood vessels and increases risk of diabetes, heart disease, and other conditions. Building social connection community is one of the most essential pillars of well-being and good health. And it's one of the reasons why you've been very forward-thinking in recognizing that and making connection a key part of the health strategy here for Washington State. And we need more people to do what Dr. Shah has done, which is to make sure that we recognize this is not just a nice to have. It's not something we'll get to when we've solved every other problem. This is deeply connected to every other problem, to our substance use disorders, to our mental health crisis, to our physical health ailments. And honestly, it's bigger than health, right? Like when you look at communities that are more connected to one another, they tend to have higher levels of economic prosperity. They tend to have lower levels of violence. They tend to be more resilient in the face of adversity, like hurricanes or tornadoes. And we know that when young people are more connected to one another, they actually tend to do better in school as well. So whether you care about health, education, the economy, or issues like division and polarization in society, all of these, it turns out, are impacted by social connection. And that's why I think it has to be a public health priority.
Well said. And I want to pivot just for a moment. First South Asian health secretary in the state of Washington. You're the first South Asian Surgeon General for the United States. How does your heritage, your background, culture, family, how does that all play into how you see things related to what you just said?
I mean, my family and culture have a huge impact on me. They've shaped everything from how I see the world to what my values are, to what I see as important, to what I see as meaningful work. They've also shaped, though, how I look at relationships and community. My parents taught me a lot, as many of our parents perhaps did. They taught me more by demonstrating and through action rather than through words. And one of the things I remember very clearly from my time growing up was that my parents, sometimes even to the annoyance of me and my sister, would often get up in the middle of the dinner and pick up the phone when a friend called. People didn't just call all the time. But when they called, especially in evening hours, it's usually because something was wrong, right? And they knew that. So when a friend called in the evening hours, they would pick up the phone. Whatever the reason was, They were usually calling because they were in pain. And one of the things that my parents taught me through that action and through what they would do as follow-up was that when people are in need, we should show up for each other. And that timing matters. That showing up a year later after somebody is in pain, it's not the same. Like, you got to show up when people need you. And they would often follow up those phone calls by going over to drop off food, by calling, the next day to check on that friend and see how they were doing. Those small actions, and keep in mind, these are not grand gestures. It's not like they were buying them like some 7-day vacation to the Caribbean or something like that so they can get their mind off of their stresses. But it turns out it's the small actions that make the big differences. If we're not there for each other, then we have to ask ourselves, like, what are we really doing? It doesn't matter if you have the best job. It doesn't matter if you have a lot of money. It doesn't matter if you're famous or well-regarded. Like, if you don't have relationships, if you're not there for the people you love, if you're not there to support your community at a time of crisis, then you are fundamentally poor, just spiritually, and emotionally. But that really informs like how I think about my life, my work as Surgeon General now. The last thing I'll say is that I realized that what they taught me was not actually specific to our culture. It was certainly embedded in our culture, and coming from India, they grew up in extended families. And my father, even though he grew up in an incredibly poor farming village where, he was so poor that my father didn't actually have anything to wear on his feet until he was like 14 or 15 years old. Because first time he wore slippers, he got blisters. He was like, what is this? Not used to it. But despite that, one thing he told me years later is he said he never knew what the word lonely meant until he left India and moved to the United Kingdom and then to Canada and the United States. In the village, even though they didn't have much money, people looked out for each other, even if they weren't related. When his mother died when he was 10 years old from tuberculosis, neighbors stepped in, other extended family from other villages came in, and they all looked after him, as if he was their own son. So I try to remember that because I think that those are the fundamental underpinnings of life that make life worth living. We just don't have to wait till the end of our lives to realize that it's our relationships that make life worth living, that give us health and true wealth and well-being. And that's the most important lesson to take from my parents.
It's not about one culture. It's about all of our cultures. And what's that, what are the themes that we can take from that?
This point about it being in all of our cultures, I think, is really important because in many of our cultures, it has receded to the background, right? And I think we have to dig deep and bring that back up. In a world that is constantly telling us, and young people in particular, that self-worth is not about that, but it's about, how famous they can be or how much fortune they can amass or how many followers they can build up. That message about what truly matters, community, is getting lost. So I do think that whichever culture traditions we come from, if we look deeply enough, we'll often find those threads of community and connection and service and care. And this is a time where we have to use the power of those cultural traditions to bring that back into people's lives.
I want to pivot to this one question that you brought up at the very beginning, which was really around the other aspects of social media, especially with our youth. And how do we really think about combating social media and the challenges of social media, especially for our younger generation? You touched on it at the beginning, but I think this is an important area of concern for you. So if you could just share some thoughts.
When parents are asked why they believe parenting is so much harder now, the top 2 reasons they cite are technology and social media. This has become really, really hard. The reason last year I issued an advisory on social media and youth mental health was because the most common question I was getting from parents was actually about social media. They wanted to know, is this safe for my kids? And behind that was a suspicion and a worry that it wasn't. To that question of, is it safe for my kids? In the way that, we have, try to get data around medicines and other products to make sure that they're safe for our children, there was not data telling us that social media was in fact safe for our kids. Then the second thing we noted was, in fact, there was more evidence of mounting harms to children. And so we found, for example, young people, adolescents who are spending 3 hours or more on social media a day face double the risk of anxiety and depression symptoms. Now, 3 hours sounds like a lot, right? But the average amount of use per day by adolescents now is 4.8 hours a day. Right? So you have many young people who are actually in that risk area. right now. So, and it goes on. Body image issues, like nearly half of young people saying social media makes them feel worse about their body image. This is young people telling us. This is not us trying to understand what might be. This is them saying it, right? And so I do think that we have run into this circumstance where we have a technology that's been around now for 20 years, but that has rapidly evolved. It's not the same as it was 20 years ago. It's very, very good at maximizing how much time our kids spend on it. But the nature of the time spent also is challenging and involves constantly comparing ourselves to others, often being exposed to harmful content, including violence, sexual content. Your kids who are 11, 12 years old who can't watch a rated R movie but are encountering, sort of sexual content online, on social media. There's also healthy activities that are being edged out of their life, right? Sleep, learning, in-person time, physical activity. When you're spending 4.8 hours a day on social media, the question in my mind is also, what are you not doing? We have lost control of social media, and among young people in particular. And we have essentially no effective guardrails in place right now in terms of the technology itself or in terms of policy and regulation to protect our kids. To me, this is morally unacceptable. Like, if we can agree on one thing in society, hopefully it's that our most sacred responsibility is to protect our children. I hope we can agree on that. The notion of just leaving it up to companies to make it safe for kids or shoving the entire burden on the shoulders of parents and saying, hey, I know you didn't grow up with this technology. I know it's being designed by some of the most talented product engineers in the world with the latest cutting edge behavioral science and neuroscience to maximize time spent. But you know what? Try your best, right? That's essentially like what we've done. It is a major contributor, I believe, to the youth mental health crisis. And this is why what I have called for last year and multiple times since then has been for Congress to put in place actual safety standards, actual requirements for data transparency from the companies so that we can protect our kids the way we decided we were going to protect people against unsafe cars years ago. What we're seeing is a result of a 20-year experiment that has taken place on all of us, but particularly on our kids. And the results have not been good for our children. I think what we need to do as a community, especially a community of parents, is come together and actually put limits on the use of social media for our kids. But we have to come together and do it because it's hard to do alone, right? Because so many parents have come up to me and said, what am I supposed to do when my child says everyone else has access to the platform and you want me to be the only one? Do you want me to be lonelier because I can't be on social media like everyone else? And that's an understandable worry, right?
It's a true art.
My
own kids.
And so it's absolutely understandable. But the only way we change that norm is when we come together because there's strength in numbers. So I think delaying till after middle school, I think restricting the use of technology so you have tech-free zones in your child's life, so you're protecting sleep and you're protecting in-person time and you're protecting learning. These are boundaries that we can draw, but would be much more effective if we're going to draw them together. Classically, I'll just say this. Look, my phones are in my pockets, right? They buzz a couple of times, and I know what they're buzzing about. They're buzzing because there's texts that are coming through on the parents thread for my two kids' classes. I get about 70 texts a day on each thread, okay? About everything you can imagine, right? Like, what are people wearing for Spirit Week? I can't pick up my son. I'm caught in traffic. Anybody can get my kid. Anybody going to sign up for this summer camp? All the kind of things that you'd want to talk about as parents, right? But you know what never gets messaged about on that thread is how are we managing tech for our kid? There's a sense of shame that parents feel about saying that, hey, I don't know how to manage technology for my kid. I don't know how to protect my child, from the harms of social media. And I'm doing my best, but I'm feeling lost. So even if we as parents can start by just having conversations with each other about our kids' experience with technology, with how we can manage it for our kids, and then move to what can we do together? What pacts can we build and hold each other, accountable to, but also so our kids know they're not alone. That would go a long way, while we're working on getting these safety standards, which are an essential part of the solution too.
I wanted to ask you a question very quickly about hope. What can we look forward to the future?
But, I feel more hopeful about public health and about society now than I did before I served. Even though I've seen more challenges, even though I've encountered more people who have shared the pain that they're experiencing, And here's why. It's because I've realized that fundamentally, that while we do need good policy, while we do need good programs in place, that fundamentally the health and well-being of society has to do with how each of us show up in our families and in our communities. Do we show up from a place of kindness and compassion and generosity, or do we show up from a place of anger and fear and insecurity? And all of us are a mix of all of these, right? We show up in different ways at different times. But in the narrative about the world today is almost entirely about the latter. It's about people showing up and hurting each other, not caring for one another. It's a narrative that breeds pessimism. It's a narrative about the contempt and division and polarization that we seem to have for one another in society. But I don't think that that's a true story of who we actually are. And I say that not just because it feels good to not believe that, but because it's actually what I see when I travel. I hear moms and dads who are actually stepping up to help other people's kids who are struggling and help other parents. I see neighbors, especially during COVID, but even before and after that, who are showing up to help other neighbors when they realize that someone's lost a job. They don't do it for the fanfare. They don't do it for headlines. They don't do it for credit. But they're doing it because they know something that we have known for thousands of years, which is that when we're living from a place of love, it feels good. It feels good. And it's who we are meant to be. And that's who we're called to be very intentionally now, more than ever. Like if you believe that we are a nation and a society that's in pain and in need of healing, like I want you to know that we all can be healers in helping people get to a better place. That it's not just people who have an MD behind their name or people who've gone to nursing school who can help. It's all of us, because it turns out at the end of the day that love is the most powerful medicine that we have. And it's one that we all have the power to dispense. And it doesn't have to take a lot of effort or time. It's the moment that we spend stopping by a coworker's office at the end of the day because we realize they had a hard time to check on them. That's love that heals. It's the moment we spend after a meeting when we realize someone was quiet. They didn't say a whole lot in the meeting. We just say, hey, just want to check on you. You doing okay? You seem pretty quiet. That's love that heals. It's when we realize that a parent is really struggling because they're going through a divorce or their child is struggling with behavioral problems and they're just at their wits' end. We swing by to say, you know what? Why don't you drop your kid off today? We'll play with my kids. Just go and rest up. Do something for yourself for an hour. That is love that heals. And when we call a friend, not with an agenda or not because we're trying to plan something, but just because we want to check on them. We don't have to solve every problem they have, but just knowing that they are not alone, knowing that they have somebody who looks out for them, that is so important in a world where so many people are walking around feeling invisible, feeling like no one cares. That's also love that heals. So what gives me hope is that we are all healers in that way. We all have this extraordinarily powerful medicine that we can command and we can dispense. And the only question is, are we able to see that? Are we able to call upon that healing energy within us? Are we able to talk about this and make decisions about the kind of values that we want to cultivate in our kids, in our communities, in our country? Because the truth is, I think all of us want to live in a place where people are kind to each other. We want to live in a place where if our kid stumbles and falls, whether that's metaphorically or literally, that there are going to be people who are there to lift him or her up. We want to know that none of us are going to be judged by our worst moment, but that people hopefully will give us the benefit of the doubt and will give us grace just as we hopefully will give others grace. That's the kind of society we want to live in. But that is not often the kind of society we see online or in the papers where, the sharp word or the retort or dunking on someone is often what seems to generate sort of reposts and attention. That's where I think we have to realize that real life is actually happening here, face to face, in our communities, in person. This is what we have to reclaim. This is how we evolved to be over thousands of years. And if we can rebuild that connection with one another, if we can call upon that compassion and generosity and love that is our birthright and our true nature, then I have no doubt that we can help each other heal. I have no doubt that we can create a society that we feel confident will be there for our kids, and a world that we'd be proud to have them grow up in.
Could not have said that better. I will just ask you all.
During a post-event press conference, Murthy and Shaw said that our nation can help bolster social connections by addressing housing and food insecurity, two top priorities for United Way of King County. They said that our communities already have the resources to combat loneliness and isolation, including the social connections that we get by gathering around food and having adequate housing.
Well, food is a powerful force to bring us together for generations and thousands of years. We could gather around the table, literal and metaphorical table, to break bread together, to eat, to have conversation, to build relationship. And I worry about that because right now what we're finding is not only are people not coming together that as often as they were to share meals, friends as well as neighbors, but often when people are together for meals, they're often distracted by their devices. So the quality of interaction can go down. When it comes to housing, housing is one of the fundamental needs that we all have. And when you are unhoused, when you don't have a place to live, when you don't feel safe where you do live, that creates stress and often a toxic level of stress in people. And that's critical because we know that stress has many effects on our mental and physical health. We know relationships are powerful buffers to stress, but you've got to make sure that people have those basic needs met, enough to feed themselves and their families, a safe place to live. These are the fundamentals that should be available to everyone.
On top of that, what I would just add is that, we've seen in our state, it's incredible investment, the governor as well as the legislature, both in terms of mental behavioral health, but also housing and rental assistance. There's so much that goes into the social elements. As Dr. Murthy said, that, when we have stable housing or the lack of food insecurity, we are in a better place. And so while all the negative things, if we don't have those aspects, if you do have the good housing as well as the optimal food, you have an opportunity for better health. And so I think that's the other driver that we're looking at, is how do we find protective behaviors, which was also such an important theme of what Dr. shared today.
To learn more about our U.S. Surgeon General and his efforts to combat loneliness and social isolation, log on to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services website, hhs.gov. To learn more about the Washington State Department of Health's work around wellness and health, log on to doh.wa.gov. United Way of King County recently launched the Our Neighbor Fund, a $12.5 million campaign to invest in strategies that keep families fed and housed and help college students stay in school. Our Neighbor Fund will enable us to provide students with free meals when school is out, leverage millions of dollars in rental assistance funding, provide students with emergency grants and housing assistance, and much more. Please help join the movement to make a difference in the lives of our neighbors. To give, log on to uwkc.org/donate. Ready for some baseball? Join us at T-Mobile Park on August the 11th for United Way of King County Day, when the Seattle Mariners take on the New York Mets. During United Way of King County Day, a percentage of each ticket sale is donated back into the community. This summer, we are focused on feeding families and keeping people housed. Hope to see you at the ballpark. For more information, log on to uwkc.org/events. At United Way of King County, we are working side by side with communities to build an equitable future for everyone. Hourglass United Way is a podcast that highlights how we and our partners spend time making a difference in our communities. Our work is made possible by the generous donations from people like you. Please send comments and suggestions about our podcast to hourglassunitedway@gmail.com. To learn more about our work or to support United Way, log on to uwkc.org. I'm your host, Joe Burris. Thanks for listening. Until next time.